Hi guys, just a warning, this contains spoilers for Deus Ex Human Revolution, the Mass Effect series, and Infamous. Player agency is all the rage in video games right now. As gaming developed, somebody somewhere decided that the more a player could actually affect the world in which a game takes place, the more immersive that world would feel, and the more invested the player would become. Multiple choice encounters, where the player picks from a list of possible script choices, can open up or close off certain narrative routes in a game, and eventually choices can combine to lead us to a particular ending. The advantage to this from a development point of view is that it is seen to increase the replayability of a game, having knock-on effects on DLC sales and, even more importantly, keeping people playing your title when they could be handing money to your competitors and playing theirs. While interactivity is the very basis of games, I can't help but feel that sometimes open narrative and player agency can have a negative effect on the nature of the narrative itself. Strong writers have something to say, and I personally find myself inspired by the saying of it. It doesn't matter if the message runs contrary to my own beliefs or if the actions taken by protagonists are at odds with what I myself would do. While I feel that many games can do great things with player choices and immersive worlds can certainly be created from such mechanics, sometimes the ending should be an ending and not a choice. A game's final scene and message should be delivered as the vision of the story that the writer wanted to tell, not a multiple choice roulette designed to please all possible playstyles. I'm going to make the possibly unpopular but readily apparent argument that sometimes player agency can interfere with effective storytelling, and that sometimes the braver move is for writers to simply deliver a strong, effective narrative than try and piecemeal player options towards an eventual pick the one you like ending. I'm going to talk about two main examples where I find this style of storytelling was effective throughout the game itself, but the endings were badly let down by the inbuilt need to try and please everybody based off their narrative choices, rather than simply allow the writers to bring the story to a close in a way that satisfied them and told the story they wanted to tell. Those two games should be the Mass Effect series and Deus Ex Human Revolution. In Deus Ex you play Adam Jensen, and one of the most epic yet subtle references in games writing, your entire life changes when you go through the Looking Glass. Okay, so the Looking Glass is actually a highly reflective computer console, but the Alice in Wonderland reference is there if you look for it, and it works. Before being thrown through the console, Jensen is already broken. He was involved in something as a police officer which everybody seems to have decided was a disgrace. He is in love with a woman and for some reason seems to be vaguely embarrassed about that love. After he is thrown through the console and subsequently fixed by the very augmentation technology that he seems to have an issue with, he is still a broken man, but he is somehow more and somehow better. He is equipped to deal with the world in which he finds himself, even if that world is now fraught with danger and suffering. The veil is lifted, and Jensen uncovers a long and convoluted tale centered in human greed and the desire for power. The woman he loves is gone, and he must find her to alleviate his guilt that he feels at her kidnapping in the first place. The mistake the bad guys make wasn't taking his love interest, it was throwing him through the console. By breaking him so utterly, they forced Jensen to grow up. Pre-console Jensen was a boy, and post-console Jensen is a man. It's a pretty massive amount of subtext, and it's all there in the first 10 minutes of the game. Mechanically, all we have done is learn how to crouch and shoot, but narratively we've learned a whole lot about our protagonist, the world he inhabits, and how he reacts to it. We are handed a moment of flux in his life, and from that point on we decide how he swims in the flux. From that point on in the game, we make decisions. Our reasons for making such decisions are personal. Perhaps we play how we feel we would play if we found ourselves in such a situation in real life. Perhaps we play how we feel a man like Jensen would react based off our interpretation of him. Or maybe we simply play through a number of times using the correct choices in a certain sequence to achieve whatever achievements are built into the game. The first choice we get is to begin our road to redemption with a focus on either lethal or non-lethal methods of dealing with bad guys. It's not a bad choice to have to make, as it's not really narratively impactful. The game mechanics operate in such a way that you have to kill some people. Boss fights can only have one resolution, and nobody is going to care if random henchman 34 is dead or alive when you reach the final portion of the game. Overall, the player choices in Deus Ex are well done, until we reach the end of the game. Upon finally achieving the narrative end goal, the player is left with 4 possible choices based on the things that they discovered throughout the course of the game. We have more, not so subtle this time, referencing of the nature and history of entertainment and literature by these choices being laid out for us by an AI. The Deus Ex Machina term stems from the Latin for God from out of the machine, a reference to highly improbable circumstances suddenly occurring that save the protagonist or bring the story to a close within literature. They are often set up by a character who wasn't even in the game up to that point. In the case of this game, the AI has been present in the game, and the choices presented all make sense within the context of the game. The Deus Ex moment itself is that Jensen gets to make a choice at all. The actual mechanism of the Deus Ex Machina is us, the player. We are suddenly drafted into the game by the writers in order to facilitate the completion of the story in such fashion as to please the audience, which also happens to be us. It feels awkward and sticky, having the sad knock-on effect that none of the endings can truly feel satisfying because they were all going to be available anyway, and we can pick an ending that completely contradicts how we actually played the game. Much like the initial boxed-in boss fights, ending each level felt clunky and restrictive, and at odds with the open world multi-option playstyle of the levels that got us there. The optional ending feels odd because Jensen goes from a man at risk to the man in charge. He transcends to the level of deity purely because the writers have given themselves no choice but to continue the trend of encouraging player agency. For me, Jensen had a fifth option, one that wasn't entertained or enforced by the writers. The fifth option was that he had no choice at all. He made it to the end of his story and then he watches the final moments play out. The connection with the audience shouldn't have been absolute power, but rather the loss of any power at all. When we watch a movie or read a book, the endings have power because we have no option but to witness them. The writer's bravery becomes apparent as they deliver the final messages and close the narrative. The story stays with us because all we can do is run the final sequences over and over in our head. Imagine if the fate of Walter White or Tony Soprano had been decided by the audience. Those conflicting opinions and stances all jumbling together into some kind of multiple choice pick and mix. I personally shudder just to think about it. Deus Ex Human Revolution is one of my favourite games of the modern age. Its science fiction setting and focus on the moral implications and complexities of transhumanism and how it all affects our understanding of humanity fascinates me. The way it deftly handles issues like loss, addiction, ego and frailty without ramming them down our throats is to be commended. But that said, the endings left me cold simply because the very nature of the choice removed any impact they actually could have had. The ending to Mass Effect was similarly flawed but for different reasons. It's hard to think of a game within recent years that was more highly praised for its storytelling, and more openly derided for its ending. Over the course of 3 games, the player built a universe and surrounded themselves with a team based on how they chose to act and interact with the people within that universe. Once again, the game dealt with incredibly heavy themes in places, like the nature and definition of life and intelligence with the Geth, or the complex interplay of world views that plays out around the Genophage storyline involving the Solarians, Turians and Krogans. It's a massively complex game, not afraid to look at relevant themes to the modern age, and throws the player into situations that, while they would never need to consider such things in real life, forces the player to consider aspects of mankind's history and possibly challenges the often touted belief that the ends justify the means. When it comes to utilisation and encouragement of player agency, the Mass Effect series is about as fine an example as one can think of, until the ending. Once again, a strong narrative is blighted by the need to give Shepard, and true Shepard the player, choice. That choice also runs heavily at odds with how the narrative mechanic has worked up to that point. The beauty of Mass Effect is the inherent cost that the big choices can charge the player. Favourite characters can be lost, which directly affect our playstyles, and potential allies can become enemies, which pit new threats against us. Perfect first time playthrough of Mass Effect is incredibly difficult because the choices we make are often blind. We don't know the effect that they will have until they play out to us. It was the need to provide an all things to all people ending for Mass Effect that would lead to it being met with such derision by many of its players. Through its mechanics, Mass Effect had taught players to deal with hardship and loss. Would it really have been so horrible for Shepard to defeat the Reapers only to find himself still awash in the tidal swellings of a galaxy which was infinitely bigger than he was? or the races who inhabited it? Would it have been so terrible for a wounded shepherd to lurch across the walkway simply to watch the final moments of the writer's visions actually play out? I don't think so. One of the best marriages of strong narrative and player agency that I can think of is Infamous. Through your actions and restraint, or lack thereof, the player decides how the city reacts to Cole and his powers. Is he seen as a hero or a villain? Either way, it doesn't actually matter. Be he a shining knight of virtue or a rabid dog who doesn't care about collateral damage, Cole is still important and still necessary. Cole is the one with the powers, and Cole is the one who can fight Kessler, and Kessler will always and forever be Cole. It doesn't matter if Cole is good or evil, whether he decides to move on into the future to fight the Beast in order to save humanity or maintain his domination of it. The Beast is the threat, and Kessler is the conduit of Cole's understanding. The revelation that Kessler, the man you have fought and the man who has cost you almost everything, is you is stunning. A fantastic moment in gaming narrative and a perfect place where both the paths that player agency could lead you down can converge. The player has no control over this fact or its reveal, and it impacts both styles of play equally. The shock is not diminished because you choose to play good or evil. While the writers utilise the player agency to get you more invested or abhorred by the world in which you play, they stop short of allowing that agency to compromise their vision of the overall narrative. What you do and how you act affects how the world looks at you, but that world and your character are still trapped in the narrative. They cannot avoid their fate. Player agency is merely centred around how you deal with the eventual knowledge of your fate. Now obviously this is all opinion, but as a fan of stories, it's important to me that nothing interferes with the narrative of a game. Mechanics should make sense within the narrative, and I have no issues with enabling player agency to a point. But when that very act of enabling the player requires the game to offer watered down choices to please all comers rather than deliver a strong ending message that is based in the themes the game explored, I find myself somewhat disappointed. There is nothing wrong with a strong tale deftly delivered, whether that ending embraces light or dark or victory or defeat. Jensen never got a choice in how his story started, and he never got a choice in what drove him forward through his own personal suffering. And I can't help but feel that a more fitting end would have been to have him as a witness, and not as a catalyst.